And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm with Professor John Kloppenborg from Toronto University. This is guys. If you don't know John Kloppenborg yet, you're gonna find out. This guy is a big deal. I'm really glad to have you on. He is a professor of religious studies with expertise in Greco-Roman culture and Judean culture and Christian origins, and he writes about Q. And by the way, this book right here, this is one of the, I'm not kidding when I say this. Like I like to read every night before I go to sleep. I read something. I don't care what it is. I might pick up some Suetonius. I might pick up some scholar stuff. This is one of the most in-depth works I've ever read. Like you have in this book right here, Christ Associations. I've never read something that goes deeper than this into the details of these early Christian groups. And by the way, is that a typo? $12 hardcover, or is that real? Because if that's real, I would get yourself a copy right now, because this book is way worth that. Way worth it. I'd pay $60 for it, but just want to throw the guys out there. The link's in the description right now. So while you're watching this, you can click on it. You click on it later. It's there. I would get a copy. It's well worth it. And yeah, how are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for the plug. I'm doing fine.
Definitely. I was just talking to someone. I was like, Kloppenborg is the scholar. Like the scholars go to Kloppenborg for stuff. Like we were talking about, I just had on Robin Faith Walsh, and she was talking about your book and was like, it's so good. I was like, yeah, it really is. So just so you guys know, links in the description for that. There's also another one, which is the formation of Q, which is kind of what we're going to talk about today. And before we get into anything, I just want to throw this out there, because there's a lot of people that watch my channel. There's a wide range of people that watch my channel. Critical approach people. A lot of them are atheists. Some of them even mythicists will watch this channel. All the way to the other spectrum, people who are full-blown believers who attend churches and have their beliefs. But people on the other side that are the former, a lot of them have this I think it's a misunderstanding of Q, where they think this is some sort of apologetic argument, when in fact it's kind of the opposite. When I used to go to church, the church I used to attend hated Q, because Q takes away from the fact that Mark and Matthew are divinely inspired. If you talk about Q, they're like, no, we can't lose God's word. We didn't lose Q. And then the other thing about people don't realize, they say there's no evidence for it, just completely hypothetical. But Papias, and one of the early church fathers, talks about this document. And this was kind of funny. It happened to me recently. Somebody was asking me about this. They said, yeah, so Papias doesn't mention Q though. And I said, well, what do you mean he doesn't mention Q? He doesn't say it's called Q. He says it's called early sources. I go, do you even realize that the Q is short for quell, which is a German word for source? And they're like, oh. I'm like, why would he say Q? That doesn't make any sense. He's going to say it the way he says it. So I just wanted to throw that out there for someone who's like, come on, Q, come on, where's the evidence, bro? So let's start off with that. What got you into Q, and what do you think about it? How much evidence is there for
it? I should say that Papias, of course, doesn't mention Q at all, because Q isn't a letter of the Greek alphabet.
Right.
It's and it certainly stands for the German word Quelle, which means source. We don't know what it was really called. It's true that it is hypothetical, in the sense that we don't have a manuscript. We certainly don't have what it might have originally been called. So it's a hypothesis, in the sense that, like a lot of other things in early Christianity, it has to be reconstructed using academic methods and logical inferences and so forth. So we can talk more about that in a bit, but sure. It's not untrue that it's a hypothesis. It clearly is. Right. And Papias, it's sometimes been argued that Papias's reference to the logia, the oracles, is a reference to Q. We can talk about that as well. What got me into it was, I suppose, I started working on the Gospel of Thomas as an undergraduate, and thinking about its sources, that is, where it got its information from. And that led me to at least the possibility that there was some kind of connection between the Gospel of Thomas and Q. I subsequently have concluded that there isn't a direct connection, but that's in fact what got me to Q. And once I got into Q, then I ended up doing a dissertation on it.
Interesting. So let's get right into what exactly it says, because we're gonna get this Q thing. This is the direct sayings of Jesus of Nazareth. This is the historical real deal. This is what he said. Obviously, we can't figure out if it's, we don't know for sure, hypothetical, and most likely. And why do we get to that conclusion, basically? So I don't know if you want to give a few examples, or where you want to start.
Well, I can explain how we got to positing or hypothesizing a document that we now call Q, and that arises from several features of the Synoptic Gospels. One of the features is that it's now pretty clear from an analysis of the three Gospels that Mark served as a kind of source or a pony for Matthew and Luke. That is, they used Mark as a kind of outline for their gospel and their Gospels. They improved it, they added to it, but they take over Mark pretty much in the order that Mark relates the stories. But Matthew and Luke also have material about the equivalent of 4,000 words or 260 or so verses that they didn't get from Mark because Mark doesn't have them. So this includes material like Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, Luke's Sermon on the Plain, woes against the Pharisees, a number of parables and so forth. So those aren't in Mark, but they're in Matthew and Luke. And in a number of cases, Matthew and Luke agree almost verbatim with one another. So, for example, the first oracle of John the Baptist, brood of vipers who warned you to flee from the coming wrath, produce the fruit worthy of repentance, and don't say to yourself, we have Abraham as a father. For I tell you, God is able to create from these stones children to Abraham, and so forth. So there, Matthew and Luke agree all together. They didn't get it from Mark because it's not in Mark. So that raises the question, well, either Matthew got it from Luke or Luke got it from Matthew, or the two of them got it from something else. And there are reasons for concluding that Luke didn't get it from Matthew and that Matthew didn't get it from Luke. And that leaves us logically only another possibility, a third possibility, namely, they're both using a common document. And so if you have a gospel parallels or a synopsis of the Gospels, you can look through that synopsis passage by passage, and you'll come across a whole series of texts where there isn't a Markan column. Normally, a synopsis has Matthew on the left, Mark in the middle, and Luke on the right. And so there'll be places where there isn't a Mark column at all, but there is a column with Matthew and Luke there. So that's the material that we, at least in the first place, focus on in thinking about what Q looked like. And as I say, it amounts to about 45 or 4,600 words of text and about, say, 230 to 260 verses, depending how you calculate verses. As I say, they didn't get that material from Mark. They got it from somewhere else, and that somewhere else is what we call Q. As I say, we don't know what it called itself. And so a German by the name of Johannes Weiss coined the word Quelle, or Q. And so that name has stuck, mostly because we don't have a better name for it.
Sure. Now, is it possible, because I'm sure someone's going to be thinking about this, and I'm thinking about it too. Is it possible that Luke or Matthew, I think Matthew comes first, Matthew makes this up first and then they copy him, or is based on, okay, sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So when I teach Synoptic Problem, what I try to distinguish for the students is that there are logical possibilities in relating three gospels to one another, and there's quite a few logical possibilities. But when you look at the logical possibilities, and one of them is that Luke gets his quote Q material from Matthew, or that Matthew gets his Q material from Luke. And so you don't need to posit a separate Q. You just say Matthew has copied Luke or Luke has copied Matthew. Now, so that's a logically possible solution. But with each one of these logically possible solutions, you have to start to scrutinize it and look at details. And that means coming up with explanations for why Luke, say, would have taken over something from Matthew and changed it and come up with something different, which would require you to posit a kind of editorial scenario that Luke, in dealing with that particular kind of Matthean material, will typically change this word to that word, will modify the text in a certain intelligible way, and that's where you run into difficulties. You know, there is a hypothesis called the Farrer hypothesis, which argues that Mark is the first of the three gospels, that Matthew used Mark, and that Luke used both Mark and Matthew, and therefore got the so-called Q material from Luke. Now, that then requires, let me give you one example where it becomes a little difficult to understand how that works. So on that hypothesis, Luke has seen Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, which is 2 full chapters of Matthew. And but Luke's equivalent Sermon on the Plain is only 29 verses long, a part of one chapter. So one would have to, and on top of that, Luke has some of the Sermon on the Mount material, but not in Luke 6, where the Sermon on the Plain occurs, but scattered throughout throughout the rest of Luke. So one would then have to come up with an explanation why Luke, seeing Matthew's coherent Sermon on the Mount, disassembles it and keeps some of it in Luke 6, but scatters other parts of it throughout other parts of his gospel. So you know, there's a Mark Goodacre has suggested that Luke just doesn't like long sermons, and that's why he has shortened and scattered the sermon. But if you look at Luke's sermons in Acts, Luke has some good long sermons. So the argument that or the hypothesis that Luke doesn't like long sermons doesn't exactly pan out when you look at Acts, because we got lots of long sermons. So that's the kind of editorial scenario that you have to propose in order to make Luke dependent on Matthew directly. You have to then come up with subsidiary hypotheses that try to explain why Luke has ended up with such a different version of Q, or a different version of the double material than Matthew has. And that's where the problem for all synoptic theses hypotheses come. That is, you have to come up not only with a logically possible solution, but you have to then propose an editorially probable solution. That is, you have to look at the way other ancient writers used sources, and presumably come up with a version that makes kind of coherent editorial sense of what any particular synoptics hypothesis imagines. So, and that's actually where a lot of these hypotheses run into trouble. That it's more difficult to explain why Luke would have done what he did if he saw Matthew, or why Matthew would have done what he did if he had seen Luke. So, as I say, you have to come up with an editorially probable or plausible solution. And in the absence of that, you end up with, I think, arguing that Matthew and Luke independently see another document, and that's what they fuse with Mark or combine with Mark. Another way of thinking of this, or illustrating this, is one of the curious features of this Q material. I'm going to call it Q material, but think of it as the material that Matthew and Luke have, but Luke doesn't. That Mark doesn't have. So one of the interesting features of it is that you can see where Matthew has connected this material with the Markan framework, the Markan skeleton, as it were, and where Luke has connected it with the Markan skeleton. They don't agree. That is, Matthew and Luke connect that double material in different places relative to Mark. Now, that's what you would expect if, for example, if you had an account of the life of Socrates, and you also had some sayings of Socrates, you and a friend working in different rooms, your job would be to produce a single document with the life and sayings of Socrates. In all likelihood, you are going to connect those two documents differently because you're going to have different editorial ideas of where to best to place this saying or that saying. And so if you came up with the identical connecting of the sayings with the stories, then somebody would say, well, one of you is copied from the other, because that's the only way that you could come up coincidentally with the same combination. If you come up with completely different combinations, then one would conclude that you're actually working in two separate rooms and you haven't communicated with one another. That is, your decisions about how to connect a saying with some anecdote from the life of Socrates has not influenced your friend's editing. You're working in two separate rooms, and therefore your decisions don't affect him, and his decisions don't affect you. And that's in fact what you find with the Matthean and Lucan double material or Q material. That is, they make different editorial decisions about how to connect this into Mark. That's exactly what you would expect if they're working independently with a sayings document and with Mark, and combining them using their own individual ingenuities, or if you want to think theologically, with their own inspirations. So that's the data that you find, and it seems to me that makes the most sense if you suppose that they're using Mark and Q independently of one another.
That did make a lot of sense, not gonna lie. Now let's get into some of these sayings, because I want to get your opinion, if I may, on what kind of philosophy or theology or ideas that Jesus had. So, for example, like some of the, like you mentioned how he said that, oh, God can raise up anyone from these stones right now. That seems kind of like it seems like, is he critical of the people around him? Is he sort of a rebel? And can you give some examples on some of the sayings that are in Q that you propose?
Yeah, so there's a series of sayings in Q that are pretty critical of a sector that he calls, or a group that he calls, this generation. And it starts with John the Baptist's preaching, which is the thing that I just quoted a bit earlier, where it's presumably directed at contemporary Jews who come out to John, and his reply is, why are you coming? The point here is repentance, and if you don't do that, then getting baptized is not going to help you, and you can't even claim to be children to Abraham, because the way Q puts it is that God, he puts it into John's mouth, God is able to create children of Abraham out of stones. You get a similar kind of criticism now in Jesus' mouth in Q7, where Jesus refers to the reception of John the Baptist and himself. He said, this is like children in a marketplace, that they're complaining to one another or calling back to one another. We piped and you didn't dance. We sang a dirge and you didn't mourn. For John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking. And you said, he's crazy, that he's demon possessed. And the Son of Man, referring to Jesus himself, came eating and drinking, and you said he's a glutton and a drunk. So it's this is also critical of the reception that both John and Jesus have received by some of their fellow Jews, who Q complains that that their fellow Jews don't listen. Not all fellow Jews, but some of them do, at least. They don't listen. So there's a whole kind of layer of Q that is very critical of the reception that Jesus and John have received. There's another layer in Q, or another stream in Q, that's not critical at all. That's where you get blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of God, and blessed are you when you're persecuted or reviled, for your wages are great in heaven, for that's what they did to the prophets, and so forth. You get the turn the other cheek saying from Q there, and lend money without expectation of return, and so forth. So that has a different kind of texture to it than the really critical polemical materials. But you find both of these in Q. You find also material that seems to imagine that the return of the Son of Man, or the coming of the day of the Lord, is pretty quick, but it's also unpredictable. So you get this very strange, interesting saying in Q17 that, as it was in the days of Noah, so also in the, with the Son of Man, that in his days they were eating and drinking and getting married and giving in marriage, and so forth. That his life was pretty much completely normal until the day that Noah entered the ark, and then the catechism came and carried them all away. In other words, it seems to be also a rejection of this notion that there's going to be signs that you can look for. That is, there'll be this sign and that sign and that sign, and then you know that it's going to happen. Q's version seems to be it comes right in the midst of the perfectly normal. The analogy that I use is, the 10th of September in 2001 was a perfectly normal day in New York City, and even at 7:00 in the morning on 9/11, it was a perfectly normal day. And then something happened in a completely unpredictable way, and a lot of people perished. That's Q's version of the apocalypse, and it's something that doesn't come with observation, where there's going to be signs here and signs there. So unlike, say, the book of Daniel, where and other apocalyptic texts, which trade in a lot of kind of predictive signs, Q doesn't have predictive signs, which makes it even more frightening.
Interesting. Now, the parables, there's quite a few parables in this Q, if I'm not mistaken, right? Now, these parables are very, very high level, seem like educated, stoic-y sometimes. Do you think Jesus of Nazareth understood a lot of the Middle Platonist philosophy of the time, maybe the Stoic? Do you think he was educated in other areas other than Judaism? What do you like?
No, I don't. I don't think so. We have other documents of early Christianity that show the influence of Stoicism. The letter of James, for example, and there's stuff in Paul's writings that suggest a kind of connection with Greco-Roman popular philosophy. You mentioned Robin Walsh, and so she's done a lot of work along those lines. But the Q material, I don't think, shows much acquaintance with Greco-Roman philosophy. It's sometimes some of the contents of Q have been compared in some ways to cynicism. So one of my colleagues in Toronto, Leif Woga, and also Burton Mack, have argued that there's a kind of cynic texture to some of the Q material. Neither of them thinks that means that Jesus, went to school with the cynics. Right. Rather, the point is that the kind of practical philosophy that you see in Diogenes of Sinope is a philosophy that's very critical of contemporary norms,
right.
and the kind of foibles and practices and conceits that people have. And it's not that there's much speculative philosophy there, but there's a lot of really sharp criticism of how humans typically act. And one could say that there's a similar kind of critical eye that you see in a lot of Q material that's critical about how people act towards one another and how they think of themselves and so forth. So in that sense, it's cynic-like, rather than other forms of piety that you find in some wisdom literature and some prophetic literature. So cynic-like rather than cynic with a kind of capital C.
And I think a lot of that too would have to do with the lifestyle, where it's like, give up your riches and just follow me. It's sort of a cynic thing. Like Diogenes was living he was living in the middle of the city of Athens in a bowl or something, with no
bathtub.
No. So I think that's a really good point, that there could be something like that, or it could just be naturally they're both forming that same behavior through different paths, and they're not like following the same thing. That could be a thing too. But that's interesting that
I would say there's analogies between some of the stuff we see in Q and what we see in popular cynic philosophy. But analogy does not mean influence or genealogy. An analogy means there's interesting similarities that don't necessarily bespeak influence. Burton Mack, in fact, suggested that some of what you see in the Hebrew prophets is cynic life. If you look at, say, the first part of the book of Isaiah, Isaiah is extremely critical of the wealthy.
Right.
And you get that kind of thing in cynicism. Now, Mack doesn't, Mack unfortunately passed away a few years ago. Mack didn't think that Isaiah was beholden to Diogenes of Sinope or anything like that. That would be crazy. But that two figures, kind of social critic figures, end up with a similar kind of approach to criticism is not at all unlikely. And so in that sense, he would have said that Isaiah of Jerusalem was cynic-like in the same way that Jesus was cynic-like, which doesn't mean that he's, gone to school with the cynics.
The last thing I want to ask you, and then we'll go to these super chats. Do you think it's possible that when you look at some of these Jewish thinkers of the time period, like Philo, or going back to Aristobulus, or going through some of these pseudepigraphal texts where they have a lot of Orphic elements and Middle Platonist elements, do you think that could have got into the Jesus movement, or do you think no? Do you think that's more Alexandrian?
Your voice is kind of breaking up. I heard you mentioned Philo, and then
it
sounded like.
Sorry about that. I'll repeat myself. Hopefully you hear this. Do you think that the contemporary Jewish thinkers of the time, or even leading up to the first century, and some of the pseudepigraphal texts, you see people like Philo, Aristobulus, some of the Orphic stuff, some of these other like I mentioned pseudepigraphal. Do you think that gets into the Jesus movement at all, or no?
I don't think there's much influence of Philo on the Jesus movement. That there could be influence of Philo on something like the letter of James, or a more distant relationship between Philo and some of the stuff in Paul. That's more possible.
Sure.
Philo was extraordinarily well educated. He's a Middle Platonist, but he knows Stoic philosophy as well. And in the Jesus movement, that is the material that's reflected in the Synoptic Gospels, you don't see anything that looks very much like Plato or Diogenes or other contemporary philosophical writers.
Gotcha.
They're contemporary. Philo is an older contemporary of Jesus. He's born in probably about 40 BC or something like that. So he's pretty close to the period, but Alexandria, culturally speaking, is a long way away from Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's not like they have the internet where you can just watch a live stream of Philo doing its teaching. That's a good point. So, Yeah. So there's a couple questions, and if you already answered this, just it's okay. You can just I'm just gonna answer them. I'm just gonna ask them anyway. So thank you, Justina Carry On for the super chat. Do we have any sources for Q, or is it just hypothetical?
It's hypothetical. That is, we don't have we. If you're asking for, do we have manuscripts of Q? No, we don't. We have what we could think of as two of the successors of Q, namely the material in Matthew and Luke, and it's possible that Clement of Rome quotes Q in a couple of places in his letter to the Corinthians. But he doesn't name his source at that point, so that we've got material that looks very Q-like. The Gospel of Thomas has Q-like material in it, although I don't think that we can make a strong argument that Thomas knows Q, or that Q knows Thomas, for that matter. So, in that sense, we don't have sources in the sense that we've got later manuscripts of Mark and later manuscripts of Matthew and so forth. It is hypothetical, and it's hypothetical in the sense that I tried to explain. That is, when you look at the materials that we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and try to sort out the logically possible relationships among those three, and the editorially probable relationships, then you end up hypothesizing a Q as the best explanation of the data that you have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Interesting. Now, let me ask you this, since we're on this. I just thought of something. Is there any examples, like you mentioned Socrates' sayings getting put into a narrative? Do we know of any other? Was this a common thing for scribes in this time period to do something like that? Do we have any other examples, maybe?
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question.
You mentioned how Socrates' sayings might have been turned into a
diet. I see. Yeah, we have a good number of examples of scribes extracting sayings from various philosophical works and producing what are called epitomes of sayings of sages. So there were things like Q that we know were produced from collecting together the sayings of Aesop, or collecting together. We've got a small collection of anecdotes of Socrates. Some of these were used in primary education. One of the ways that you learned how to write in the ancient world is by getting collections of what are called crea. That is a short, pithy saying attributed to a philosopher like Diogenes of Sinope, and students would get these collections and have to first copy them out kind of verbatim, and then start to play with them to paraphrase Socrates' response or Diogenes' response, and play with it grammatically, and paraphrase it in various ways. That's one of the ways that you learned the basics of rhetoric, how to take a saying and redeploy it in another context. And the kind of exercise that they used are exactly sayings of Menander, sayings of Socrates, sayings of Cynic philosophers, and so forth. And we've got school exercises from Greco-Roman Egypt where you can see these are the kind of exercises that were being used in education. So, not a surprise really that early Christians also could have produced little collections of sayings of Jesus. And later on, we have documents like the Sentences of Sextus, which is a Christian composition, a much, much longer collection of proverbs and notable sayings attributed to Sextus, a philosopher, but in fact all Christian in content.
That's very interesting. And by the way, those are another prime examples of two people who wrote nothing down, left no physical evidence, but we have people writing sayings of them, and then later on writing full-blown narratives. Diogenes and Socrates, two prime examples of that. So that's very interesting to think about. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for the super chat. In a nutshell, who was this guy called Jesus? Who was this guy called Jesus? Did he really think that Armageddon was right around the corner?
Well, as far as we can tell from gospel material, the word Armageddon doesn't ever appear. That occurs only in the Apocalypse of John, which is not written by Jesus. Of course, it's written by an apocalypticist towards the end of the first century. So, who was this guy called Jesus? Well, his name actually was Yeshua or Joshua. A relatively common name for a Jewish male in the first century. Did he really think that Armageddon was right around the corner? I don't think so. But he did apparently believe that there was going to be some kind of major transformation of human existence, which he called the kingdom of God, that was coming at some point I think in the near future for Jesus. It's a little bit complicated because the gospel writers, when in recording the Jesus material, have different perspectives on just how soon the end is. The author of the Gospel of Mark, who records a lot of the Jesus material, seems to think that it's coming really quickly, perhaps in connection with the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. But when you look at Luke takes these stories, many of these parables, and has them begin with, there was a man who had a household and had household slaves, and he went away, and he was delayed in coming back. So there's a whole series of these parables that feature a delay. And that seems to reflect early Christian consciousness, or at least the consciousness of some early Christians, that maybe the end wasn't coming as soon as they thought it was coming. And so they start telling these stories of a delayed return. And the point is that even though the master has been delayed in coming back, you better still be doing what you're supposed to be doing, because he might come unexpectedly and then you'll be in deep trouble. So right. A story like that is pretty transparently told in order to accommodate the fact that things haven't happened as soon as everyone thought they were going to happen. But you should still be paying attention, not sleeping, as it were. Wow. So there's a whole range of apocalyptic expectations that you find in early Christian material, from the Apocalypse of John, that really does think it's coming very quickly, to Luke and other writers who are not so sure about that.
Interesting. Thank you for that super chat. Thank you for that answer. Constellation Pegasus says, once again, thank you for the super chat, by the way. Just about forgot. Why do Bibles keep Mark 16, 9 through 20 in them when the commentary admits they are forgeries? They kicked them out in 1945, but put them back because people were evidently upset and vocal about it.
That's a very good observation, and I think you've actually supplied the reason, because people were upset and didn't like those things being excluded. There's a whole series of passages that we could include. So the story of the woman caught in adultery in John 7:53 to 8:1 pretty clearly doesn't belong to the Gospel of John, and even early copyists, the copyist of Codex Sinaiticus marks it in such a way that indicates that he's not sure that this should be there, and there's all sorts of good reasons to conclude that it wasn't part of the Gospel of John. Yet I dare say that there's probably not a single English translation of the Bible that doesn't put it in there, because it's such a great story. And I suppose if you excluded it from a Bible, you would get all sorts of people writing in saying, you've missed out an important part, and you missed, the longer ending of Mark 16, 9 to 20. There's a shorter ending of Mark 2. they get put in either in footnotes or in smaller print or sometimes in regular print as if they're really there. Uh, the Bible has been with Christians for a very long time, and they get kind of habituated to what they think ought to be there. And when critical scholars say, well, that actually wasn't original, then you get some pushback. And so Bible translators, and most Bible translators are connected with Christian confessions, that is Christians, they're sensitive to the problem of excluding bits from the Bible. If this were just up to scholars, we would have Bibles that didn't have those in them at all, or they would be in the footnotes or in the apparatus saying later manuscripts add ... And as I say, there's plenty of places in the Bible where there's exactly those kinds of problems. But Bible translators also often come from churches. They're sponsored by churches, and they end up being sensitive to the sentiments of Christians.
Interesting. Thank you for that question, Constellation Pegasus. Thank you so much, by the way, and thank you for that answer. Philip A. Demick, thank you for the super chat. Why isn't Q one of the non-canon like Judas Thomas?
Well, in a way, it is. If you look at a publication like I think Robert Funk's The Five Gospels, it's there along with Thomas, and then he's got another collection called the Complete Gospels. So Q is there, Gospel of Thomas is there, all sorts of other Gospels are there. If you're asking why it's not in the Christian canon, well, the Christian canon is formed over a period of centuries. Sometime, it gets kind of stabilized about in the 4th century. But by the 4th century, if Q existed, it had long since disappeared by that time. And Thomas, even though it existed in the 4th century because it's in the Nag Hammadi Codex, Codex 2, it wasn't one of the documents that church councils thought worthwhile putting into the canon, and so it doesn't make it in. So Q had probably disappeared by that time, and Thomas had virtually disappeared. It still existed in a bunch of buried documents at Nag Hammadi, but it wasn't in wide circulation. So unless the document was in wide circulation, it wasn't even a candidate for being considered part of the Christian canon. And so neither of those documents, and a lot of others, never made it into the canon.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that super chat, Philip. Humanist Reformation. Thank you for the super chat. I really appreciate this. Really, everyone's been awesome tonight. Really, really great chat. Seems Jesus does not know the exact time, but knows it will happen in the disciples' generation. But Jesus, like Noah, did not know the exact minute or second, but knew it would be his generation, just as Jesus knows it will be the disciples' generation. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's an interesting comment, and it actually combines what Mark says with what Q says. And Mark and Q have slightly different eschatologies. So it's in Mark's gospel in 1 that he says, there are many standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come in power. Now, I think the plain sense of that is that that the kingdom is going to come sometime in the second half of the 1st century. That is, some people are not going to die before they see it happen. Q's view is different because Q eschews that kind of predictive discourse entirely. In fact, Q says the kingdom does not come with signs to be observed, so that we'll say, see here and see there. And then you get the story, the example about Noah and the example about Lot, where things were perfectly ordinary before it happened, and then bang, it happens. So that probably still anybody who says that probably still thinks it's going to happen relatively soon. That is not 2,000 or 3,000 years later. But it's much definite about exactly when, except to say that you can't predict at all because it comes in the midst of utter normality. So as I say, there's differences in eschatological beliefs between Q and Mark, with Q being a lot less definite about when things are going to happen. But surely the Q people thought that it was going to happen sometime soon for them.
Wow, that's interesting. Thank you for that super chat. It's a really good point too. Like, the text clearly says it's going to happen. Some of you will not taste death before the Son of Man comes turning in his glory. Well, that's pretty specific right there, if you ask me. So
that's right. Yeah. It's
very, very good point there. Human history formation. Thank you for that super chat. Graham Pong, thank you for the super chat. Could Q be considered anti-Mark?
In some ways, that's been argued. Werner Kelber, in one of his books, I'm missing the title right now. He argued that Q represents kind of the oral presence of Jesus. He thinks of Q as being largely, not that it wasn't written, but that it was performed orally. And in the oral performance of Q, Jesus was imagined to be really present. Whereas Mark focuses on the dead Jesus. Jesus is not here, he's risen. And the Mark and Jesus, curiously, although Mark says Jesus teaches quite a lot, there's actually very little teaching in Mark. And the teaching is kind of cloaked in secrecy. So Kelber doesn't ever say that Q is anti-Mark. He'd probably be more likely to say that Mark is anti-Q. That is, Mark really doesn't like this kind of oral prophetic presencing of Jesus at all. While that was a really an interesting idea, I don't think Kelber has been followed very much in it. There's many other interesting things that are useful about Kelber's book. It's called The Oral and the Written Tradition. And he's kind of plays the oral tradition Q against the written tradition Mark, playing them off against each other. It's a little bit like, Plato's or Socrates in Plato, right. Socrates' attitude towards oral poets, he doesn't have much use for them because, and he's very critical of oral poetry
and Homer.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because he sees how this can be used to manipulate and to create false emotions and so forth. So in a way, Kelber's view of Mark versus Q is kind of an analogy to Plato's view of Homer.
Right. That's a good point.
The kind of struggle between orality and literate tradition.
Yeah, and the Republic. I think is it Socrates that says this, where he says, "I cannot believe Homer would make Achilles crying in Hades. Achilles would never cry in Hades. You can't do that." I'm reading that and I was like, wow, they're critical. So
that's right. Yeah. And this is kind of the struggle between orality and literacy.
Yeah, good point. Thank you for that question, Grandpa. Jason Sobak, Lord of the Four Corners. Does Dr. Kloppenborg think detractors of Q fail to take into account the tendency of Judaism and many Greco-Roman religions to put an emphasis as much as written teachings? I'll put this back up.
No, I don't think the detractors from Q, most of the detractors from the Q hypothesis, like my friend Mark Goodacre and others, the issue is not orality versus literacy for them. The issue for all of us is how best to explain the literary relationships between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So it has very little to do with either discounting or emphasizing orality. You know, in the ancient Mediterranean world, where perhaps at best 10% of the population, and maybe even less than that, was literate, it meant that most people got what information they knew through oral sources, by hearing someone read a document, perform a play, read Homer, read the Bible, whatever. So most people would have got the information that they had through oral means, and only a very small minority, was in a position to actually engage literate technologies. Though I don't think many people would disagree with that kind of statement. So it's really not a kind of battle between among scholars between whether oral tradition or literate tradition, to emphasize one or the other. They're both there. They're there in much different proportions than exist in our culture, where the majority of persons are able to read and access literate media.
Interesting. Thank you for that question, and thank you for that answer. Here's a good one. And by the way, if the super chats, they pop up, I can't miss them. I can see them. They're all colorful. If I see your questions and it's not a super chat, I will try to get to them. I just can't see them all. But anyways, do you think Jesus thought that he was the Messiah?
Boy, that's a great question. Here, if you look at gospel materials, you see different answers. In Mark, it seems very clear, because in the trial scene, he's asked that question and he says yes. And the same, and Matthew and Luke, who are both using Mark, take over that notion. Q seems to be a little bit more diffident about this. As far as we know, Q never uses the word Christos, the Greek translation of Mashiach, and applies it to Jesus. The place where Jesus seems to self-identify is in a passage that occurs in Q7, that is Luke 7, where John the Baptist sends a message from prison asking Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect another?" And in both Matthew and Luke, that is, so in Q, the response is, "Go and tell John what you see and hear." And then you get a list of wonders: the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the poor have the good news announced to them, which seems to be an elliptical way of saying yes, I guess. He doesn't say yes. He just says, "Go tell John what you see and hear, that these things are happening. And blessed is the one who does not take offense in me." So as I say, that looks like a kind of yes.
Sure.
It doesn't use the term Messiah, though. It uses the term "the one who is to come." Now, is that the Messiah? Or I think, as many of your hearers will know, Qumran, the people at Qumran, actually expected three kind of coming figures: two Messiahs, a Messiah of Aaron and a Messiah of Israel, apparently a priestly and a more political Messiah. But they also expected a prophet to come. So there was at least three figures, and other documents from Second Temple Judaism had other ways of naming a coming figure: Melchizedek, or Enoch, or something like that. So Messiah was one of the possibilities, but it wasn't the only possibility. And Q, in fact, as I say, doesn't use the word Christos, or the Greek translation of the word Messiah. So I think it would probably be wrong to say that Q thinks of Jesus as the Messiah, because the word just doesn't appear there.
Wow, that's very interesting. Thank you for that question. Yakub Itzraim, thank you for the super chat. What exactly does Papias say about these sources? Good question.
So Papias, this is quoted by the 4th century author Caesarea. And he reports a couple of these sentences of Papias, and the one that attracts the most attention is the claim that Matthew collected or arranged the logia, the oracles, in the Hebrew dialect, which probably means Aramaic, and everybody interpreted them as they could or as they would. So that's what he says.
Wow.
So Matthäus collected or arranged the oracles in the Hebrew dialect, and everyone interpreted them as they could or were they able. Now that has been in the 19th century. That had as the Q hypothesis was developing, a number of scholars saw that in Papias and said, well, he's talking about Q. He doesn't call it Q, he calls it the oracles. Does Q consist of oracles? Well, there's some oracles in it, but there's a lot of stuff in it that are not obvious oracles. So that's one question. Does that actually fit the contents of Q? And I think nowadays, most people who work on Q and Synoptic Problem would say that's who knows what Papias was talking about, but it's not at all clear that he was talking about Q. There's another question: did Papias actually know what he was talking about?
Right.
That is, does Papias actually have any information at the beginning of the 2nd century? Does he actually have any idea about how Matthew was composed? And he seems to suggest that Matthew initially composed in Aramaic. Well, there's actually no good reason to think that was the case at all. Matthew is composed in Greek. When Matthew quotes the Bible, he quotes it in the Septuagint, not in the Masoretic text. So there's very little reason to think that Matthew is originally a Hebrew or an Aramaic composition. And that makes me think that this is a kind of interesting rumor that Papias has, but it's not a rumor that has much foundation in knowledge about Matthew.
And this is about 158 in the Common Era, around there.
Probably the first decade of the 2nd century, let's say, between 100 and 110. So it's pretty early.
Earlier. Wow, I thought, okay, that's really early then. So at early 2nd century, we have somebody mentioning a Hebrew sayings that Matthew and Mark used, but nobody responds to this. Nobody engaged. Nobody says that's not true. Is there anybody that responds to this at all, or no? It's just completely on its own.
Well, he just drops this saying, and Eusebius picks it up and quotes it, and then and it's had an interesting legacy because one of the first scholars to pick this up is Friedrich Schleiermacher, and this is in 1835. He writes, I think in 1835 or 1832, he writes an essay that looks at Matthew, and he credits this. He credits Papias with knowing something, and so he says the sayings material in Matthew are the logia, or the oracles, and the narrative materials are a kind of Mark-like document. He doesn't think Matthew used Mark, but he thinks that Matthew had access to a kind of a narrative thing, and he put the logia together with a narrative material. Now, Schleiermacher didn't think that Matthew wrote in Hebrew, and I don't remember him actually saying whether he thinks that Matthew's source is an Aramaic source or a Greek source. But so he uses Papias' statement to construct a kind of hypothesis about the composition of Matthew.
Wow.
He actually thought that Mark was dependent on Matthew, and that Luke was dependent on Matthew as well. So he's an exponent of what's called the Griesbach hypothesis, or what's now called the two gospel hypothesis. But that notion that Papias was referring to some kind of collection of sayings that Matthew ultimately had access to, has a reasonably long life. It lasts for a good part of the 19th century and then disappears as a working hypothesis in the 20th century. And it's for the reasons that I said. It's first off, it's not obvious that Q, the contents of Q or the contents of Matthew, are properly said to be logia, oracles.
Sure.
And it's at least a bit dubious whether Papias knew what he was talking about, whether this is just a rumor that he passes on and there's nothing to it. So now the current study of Q is not founded on Papias at all, which would be a pretty shaky foundation.
I understand. Thank you for that question. Derek Lambert from Myth Vision Podcast. You go and subscribe to that channel if you haven't by now. You live under a rock. What are the top 3 sayings of Jesus that you really cannot see explained away? Meaning he most certainly actually said those sayings. Great scholar.
Said these. Wow. That's a good question.
It is.
Well, let me take one from Q at least.
Sure.
This is one that was a kind of favorite for Ed Sanders. This is somebody volunteers to follow Jesus and says, "But first let me bury my father." And the response of Jesus is, "Let the dead bury the dead. You follow me." Now, the reason that one might say that this is probably as close to 100% Jesus as you can get is that it expresses a sentiment that is kind of shocking when one takes into account that not only for Jews of this period, but for basically all Mediterraneans in this period, you had a filial duty to take care of the dead of your family. Especially, sons had a duty to take care of a dead father or a dead mother. So much so that in later Jewish law, in the Mishnah, it says that those who have unburied dead, that is, the dead have not yet been taken care of, are exempted from saying the Shema, Hear, O Israel, which would be one of the most important pious duties of a pious Jew, to say the Shema every day. So you're exempted from saying that until you have buried your father. In other words, this is duty number one, takes precedence over everything else. And so to have Jesus kind of say, "Let the dead bury the dead," would at least be a shocking saying to make. And of course, it's a little bit hard to imagine later Christians coming up with this and putting it in Jesus' mouth, because Christians didn't leave their dead lying around helter-skelter on the, they also took care of them like other good Mediterraneans, of, burying them in an appropriately pious way. This is called the criterion of dissimilarity. That is, things that really stick out as kind of shocking, that kind of violate cultural norms, that if anything goes back to Jesus, it's probably that. Something that's not a saying of Jesus, but something that happened to him, is the baptism by John the Baptist. That he had an affiliation with John the Baptist and that he was apparently baptized by him has been argued by many that that's probably one of the bedrock bits of tradition, because all of the gospel writers, that while they record it, John actually dodges it. John's gospel doesn't actually say that Jesus was ever baptized, but the others do. And they're embarrassed about this, because it's pretty clear what John's baptism was about. It was a baptism of repentance for sin forgiveness. And very quickly, early Christians came up with the view that Jesus didn't need that, because he was without sin, which then raises the logical problem: why was he baptized if he didn't need to be? So the Matthew and Luke solve that problem in two different ways. Matthew adds a little conversation between Jesus and John the Baptist, where Jesus comes to John the Baptist, and John says, I shouldn't baptize you. You should be baptizing me. In other words, Matthew creates this little conversation that makes it clear that John recognizes that Jesus doesn't need to be baptized. And then Jesus replies, let it be this way, so that all righteousness be fulfilled. Doesn't explain what that means, but it seems to suggest there's a real plan here. You don't know it. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but you just comply with the plan. And so then John consents and baptizes Jesus. Luke solves the problem in a different way. He puts John into prison before Jesus gets baptized. So if you look at Luke's gospel, Luke 3:18 to 20, just this passage right before Jesus gets baptized, John gets put into prison, which means that in Luke's world, John didn't baptize Jesus. It wasn't a baptism of repentance because John didn't do it. It was apparently a kind of auto-baptism. Jesus baptized himself. But so that solves the problem too. By getting John off the scene, you eliminate the offense of having Jesus being baptized by John. But that surely suggests that Jesus really was baptized by John. And then early Christian writers then have to kind of come up with an explanation of why that was the case.
Yeah.
And as I say, if you read the Gospel of John carefully, Jesus doesn't get baptized at all.
Wow.
John sees a vision. He sees the dove descending on Jesus, but he doesn't say that he baptized him. So they're all kind of squirming a little bit at that fact, which probably means that it did happen.
That's such.
So those are the kind of two of the candidates that I would say are probably, pretty close to solid Jesus. And there's others that are a bit more dubious.
Now, just to throw one more in there that I'm thinking of that maybe you can confirm, when he talks about on the Sabbath, if your animal falls into a ditch, won't you go and get it? Does that seem like something that somebody wouldn't normally say that might be historical?
Yeah, that's a bit more complicated, because we do have we do have some later rabbinic movement. Well, first off, there's of course a difference between animals and humans. Rabbinic authorities, and I think probably everybody else in the Jewish world, would say, if your son or if your wife or if your brother falls into a ditch and is in danger of drowning, even on the Sabbath, of course you pull him out, because life always trumps everything else. The duty to save life and the duty to preserve life trumps absolutely everything else. Becomes a little iffier when it becomes a live, a cow or a donkey or whatever. And there, the Jewish authorities are a little bit more unclear about this. Some just say you don't do anything. You can put food in so that it doesn't starve, but if it's in a ditch that's filled with water, the food is irrelevant. Others say you can put something in, and if it gets out, it gets out. That is, you can put a stick in or something like that. And I presume others, I think the livestock owner says, of course you pull them out. I'm not going to lose the value of a sheep, which is probably about 2 months' wages for a shepherd, just to comply with the Sabbath. I mean, I think you have to imagine that there's a whole range of attitudes depending on whether you own sheep or not, and whether you can afford to lose a relatively wealthy animal. And on the other side, persons who are very concerned with upholding the violation, the prohibition about doing work on the Sabbath. So I wouldn't say that would be a high candidate for authenticity. That Jesus had a different attitude towards the Sabbath, I think that has a greater likelihood of going back to authentic material. Although Ed Sanders, who I mentioned before, was very dubious about whether the Sabbath stories go back to Jesus at all, and wondered whether these are not just constructions to differentiate early Christ believers from Pharisees and other kinds of people who had much more rigorous views on the Sabbath.
Interesting. Thank you for that super chat. And there's one more from Derek. Do you find anything in Paul that seems to stem from words Jesus actually spoke? Maybe 1 Corinthians 11, the night he was handed over meal? Love, Dr. Kloppenborg.
Yeah, sure. It's in 1 Corinthians that you find a few sayings that look like they come from Jesus. There's the one that you just quoted from 1 Corinthians 11. There's also the divorce prohibition, which Paul says it comes from the Lord, not himself. That is that if people are married, they should not seek divorce and remarriage. And he says, I say this from the Lord, not me. So he seems to be aware of a saying of Jesus at that point. And the other one is in 1 Corinthians 9, where he says, aren't I? And he's arguing about support. Aren't I allowed to travel with a wife? Aren't I allowed to take support from you guys? And then he quotes this saying about the worker is worthy of his hire, which is a saying that shows up in Q. Now, curiously, he quotes the saying and then basically says, but I'm not going to avail myself of it. I'm not going to avail myself of that privilege. So he seems to know that there's a saying of Jesus, but doesn't feel bound by it, or doesn't feel like he actually needs to use that in support of his own activity. So, but as I say, it's in 1 Corinthians that you've got about 3 sayings that look like he does know Jesus' tradition, and in fact, in 1 Corinthians 11, he does say it. I'm handing on to you what I myself received, that on the night that he was handed over, he took bread, etc., etc.
And you think that's talking about a historical event, that particular phrase?
Well, at least he's quoting the words of institution from Luke there, so it's as close to a historical event as we can get. But that raises the question of whether those words of institution are either his, or are they a kind of secondary ritual development of early Christian groups. It's pretty hard to tell the difference between the two.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that question and answer. That'll be a highlight right there. That's a good one. Constellation Pegasus, thank you once again for another super chat. If Jesus was the Messiah of all mankind and defeat and destroy the devil and all of that stuff, then why was he not yelling and screaming that information all over the place? He actually wanted people not to know that.
Okay, there's a lot packed in there.
Yeah.
So he doesn't claim to be the Messiah of all mankind. If he ever claimed to be the Messiah, and I'm not sure that he did, it would be the Messiah of the people of Israel. You say, why was he not yelling and screaming that information all over the place and actually wanted people not to know it? Well, there you're actually referring to Mark there. So one of the curiosities of Mark, the construction of Mark's gospel, is that Jesus does things. He effects miracles. He casts out demons, and then he tells people not to say this. Now, this is a literary trope of the author of the Gospel of Mark, and it appears repetitively throughout the Gospel of Mark, and sometimes achieves rather absurd proportions. So, one of the examples is when Jesus raises Jairus's daughter. This is in Mark 5. He raises her from the dead, and then he says, "Don't tell anybody about this." What are we to imagine? That they kept the girl in a closet for the rest of her life, hiding the fact that she had been raised from the dead? So at this point, you see how absurd the Markan, if you take literally the Markan command, you can't take it literally because it produces an absurd result. And in fact, even though Jesus commands the people whom he heals not to say anything, they turn around and say something anyway. Of course they do. So Mark uses this as a kind of trope to make the point that Jesus wasn't about self-promotion, and so he continually tried to hide what he did, not very successfully because the people broadcast it anyway, and also to hide his identity. That is, that when he discloses his identity to his disciples at the confession of Peter and at the transfiguration, he tells them not to tell anybody. That's probably for a somewhat different reason. That for Mark, at least, Jesus' identity is only partly that he's the Son of God, miracle-working Son of God. For Mark, it's also that he's a dying Messiah. And the disciples haven't learned that part of it yet because it hasn't happened yet. And so there's a kind of double secret in Mark. One of them is the secret of the Son of God, and one of them is the secret of the dying Son of Man. And for Mark, you have to understand both halves of the secret before you're allowed to disclose it. And ironically, the one character in Mark's gospel who gets it right is the centurion in Mark 15, looking at the dead Jesus, says, "Truly, this was a Son of God." So he actually puts together Son of God with a dying victim. He gets the right answer, but he's also not a disciple.
Right.
Says this. So this, it's a very interesting literary construction that Mark creates with his secrecy motif. That's not part of Q at all. It's not part of the Gospel of John. It's not part of other accounts. It's in Matthew and Luke because they're using Mark as a pony and they're taking over some of that secrecy stuff. But it's not part of Q's fabric at all. So,
wow, that's interesting. Mark's basically writing a mystery at that point.
That's exactly what it is. Think of Mark as a mystery story. It's the kind of mystery story or detective story that we've seen 100 times, where in the very opening scene, you are told the identity of the murderer or whatever, and then it sort of flips to the detective who ploddingly, we watch the detective then sort of ploddingly uncover clues and finally come up with the answer. Mark's gospel has the same kind of literary conceit to it. So he tells you right at the beginning what Jesus' identity is, because he begins with the introduction. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it was written in Isaiah the prophet. And then he has the baptismal scene where God actually confirms this. This is my beloved Son. But then the rest of the gospel, no one on the Markan stage, as it were, can figure out who Jesus is. The demons sort of know, but they're stopped from speaking. The disciples don't really know. Until sort of halfway through, the light kind of partly goes on, and they're told to shut up. And it's not until the very end that the secret comes out again. So, reading Mark against one of these kind of detective stories, as I say, where the audience, the reader, knows right from the beginning what's happened, but the people on the stage don't know until the very end. That's exactly how Mark's gospel is constructed.
Wow, that's very interesting. That was it for the super chats. I just want to mention that there's the Formation of Q is available on Amazon, as well as my favorite, which is Christ Associations. And this one right now is very affordable. I mean, we're talking hardcover for $12. I'm pretty sure when I got it, there was a lot. I think it was like 60 when I got it, but it was worth it. So if you're out there, click the links in the description and get the book. It's so detailed. It goes so deep, into early Christianity. And you talk about the burial sites, the catacombs, and the different markings and what it says, and you have images of like some of the Latin stuff that's in these burial places and different groups. I forgot what you call them. They're all like unions kind of, but like certain different locations, different geographic locations have different, like, oh, this place builds ships. Oh, this place does work. And they had their different groups, and they had their associations, and they're gathering in different locations. A place that used to be a Mithra worship, this place used to be Apollo, and now the Christians are going there, and they're mingling with the pagans, and they're fitting right in there. Very good book, very worth it. I would check it out. And anything else what you'd like to say?
No, thanks for the plug again. It was a fun book to write.
Oh, there was actually one more last super that just popped up from Derek. Render unto Caesar. Do you think Jesus said this? That's a good question.
Yeah, I think he probably did. I'm not a historical Jesus scholar. I work on literary stuff, and I've taught courses on the historical Jesus, but moving from Mark backwards to Jesus is a tricky procedure. I think that's probably an authentic saying. What it actually means is a different question. So, what is it that belongs to Caesar? And because he says, and render unto God what is God's.
Right.
Is this pitting Caesar against God, or are there things that legitimately belong to Caesar, like taxes? So he might have said it, but understanding what he actually might have meant by that is a different question entirely.
Wow, interesting. Thank you for that last second super chat. And that'll do it for tonight. Thank you for your time. I really, really appreciate it. We'll definitely do this again in the future. And you have just attained true gnosis.
Okay.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over